My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 29 years old, and at a family dinner just a few months ago, my father leaned back in his chair, looked me straight in the eye, and announced to the entire table, "Your sister is successful and responsible. Unlike you, she doesn't need help." Everyone laughed. But the real story, the one they never saw coming, was filed away in a folder on my desk, marked in red. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. The scent of roasted chicken and my mother's overpowering perfume filled our dining room in Ohio. It was a typical Sunday dinner, which meant the air was thick with unspoken rules and simmering tensions. My older sister, Amanda, sat to my father's right, the seat of honor she'd occupied since we were children. I was on the other side, next to a cousin who was more interested in his phone than in making conversation. The table was full of extended family, aunts, uncles, a few cousins, all of them witnesses to the quiet, systematic way my family had always sanded me down, making me smaller and smaller until I barely took up any space at all. For years, I had perfected the art of being invisible at these gatherings. I would eat quietly, smile when spoken to, and offer to help clear the plates. It was a survival tactic. If I didn't draw attention to myself, they might forget to remind me of all the ways I fell short. But that night, my father was in a particularly boastful mood. He had just finished a long story about a golf game, his voice booming across the table, and now he was raising his glass of wine. "A toast," he declared, his eyes finding Amanda. "To my daughter, Amanda, a true success story, building her own business, making a name for herself. We are so proud." Glasses clinked. I raised my water glass, my lips forming a smile that felt like cracking glass. Amanda basked in the praise, a small, smug smile playing on her lips. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice smooth as silk. My uncle, trying to be inclusive, turned to my father. "You must be proud of both your girls, Tom. Claire's doing well for herself too, right?" I held my breath. It was a simple, kind question, but I knew it was a landmine. My father took a slow sip of his wine, placing the glass down with a heavy thud. He looked from my uncle back to me, his gaze dismissive, almost pitying, and then he said it. "Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you. She doesn't need help." The words didn't just hang in the air. They landed like stones, sending ripples of awkward silence across the table before they were swallowed by a wave of uncomfortable laughter. My mother laughed the loudest, a high, tinkling sound that was meant to smooth things over but only sharpened the cruelty of the statement. My cousins snickered, and Amanda, my perfect, successful sister, smirked as she took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of her glass with a look of pure triumph. In that moment, the world seemed to slow down. I could feel the heat rising. In my cheeks, a burning tide of shame and anger. My fork felt heavy in my hand. The food on my plate, once appetizing, now looked like ash. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and list every single accomplishment I had ever earned, every late night I had studied, every obstacle I had overcome on my own. But I did none of those things. I just sat there, frozen, the laughter of my family echoing in my ears. It was a familiar feeling, this public humiliation, but it had never been so direct, so brutal. I felt like a child again, standing on the outside of a circle, begging to be let in, only to be laughed at. The roast chicken, the wine, the smiling faces, it all blurred into a single painful portrait of a family that had no place for me. And as I sat there, trying to remember how to breathe, I knew something inside me had finally, irrevocably broken. The weight of my father's words pressed down on me, but it wasn't a new weight. It was the same one I'd been carrying my entire life, just heavier now. That dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the grand finale of a lifetime of comparisons, a 29-year-long performance where I was cast as the perpetual disappointment, and Amanda was the star. My childhood memories are watercolored with this favoritism. I remember my 8th birthday. I had wanted a specific telescope more than anything in the world. I had circled it in catalogs, left notes on the fridge, and talked about the stars non-stop for months. On my birthday morning, I unwrapped a sensible sweater and a book about geology. An hour later, Amanda, whose birthday wasn't for another 6 months, was given a brand new bicycle, just because she'd mentioned wanting one a week earlier. "Amanda's the athletic one," my dad had explained, ruffling her hair. "She'll get more use out of a gift like that." I never mentioned the telescope again. It was always like that. When Amanda got an A- on a history paper, she was praised for her brilliance. When I got a perfect score on a statewide math exam, my dad glanced at the certificate and said, "Well, you've always been good at nerdy things." Her popularity in high school was a source of family pride. My love for the library was a source of concern. "You need to get out more, Claire," my mother would say with a worried frown. "You don't want people to think you're strange." They saw Amanda as a reflection of their own success, a beautiful, charming extension of themselves. They saw me as a problem to be solved, a project that never quite turned out right. This narrative was so ingrained in our family dynamic that everyone followed their lead. Aunts and uncles would ask Amanda about her exciting social life, then turn to me and ask if I was still into books. It was a constant, subtle reminder of my place. When it came time for college, my parents took out a second mortgage to send Amanda to a private liberal arts school 3 states away. The tuition was astronomical, but they insisted she deserved the best possible start in life. Her degree was in art history. When my turn came, the money had mysteriously dried up. "We have to be realistic, Claire," my father said, sitting me down at the same dining room table. "Amanda's education was an investment in her future. With your interests, a state school will be more than adequate." So I went to Ohio State. I worked 2 jobs to cover what my scholarships and loans didn't, serving greasy food at a diner until midnight and shelving books in the law library in the early mornings. I rarely came home for holidays because I couldn't afford the time off. While Amanda was posting photos from her semester abroad in Florence, funded by my parents, I was surviving on instant noodles and the sheer, stubborn refusal to fail. They called my absence antisocial behavior. They called Amanda's travels becoming worldly. I graduated with honors from law school. They sent a card. When Amanda graduated, they threw a party that cost more than my first year's tuition. All those years, all those little cuts and dismissals, they all led back to this moment, sitting at the dinner table with my insides screaming. The laughter had died down, replaced by that thick, uncomfortable silence that follows a moment of casual cruelty. My mother began bustling around, asking if anyone wanted more potatoes, a desperate attempt to pretend nothing had happened. My father, oblivious, started talking about the stock market with my uncle. They had moved on. For them, the moment was over, but Amanda wasn't finished. She leaned toward me, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that was for my ears only, laced with venomous pity. "He's right, Claire," she said, her perfect smile never wavering. "Maybe just accept your place." Her words were the final twist of the knife. It wasn't just my parents. It was her too, my own sister, the one who knew how hard I worked, the one who knew about the loans and the long nights, was reinforcing the narrative. She needed me to be the failure so she could be the success. Our identities were linked. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat feeling like a stone. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I looked down at my plate, focusing on the swirl of gravy next to my mashed potatoes. I took a slow, deliberate breath, then another. I could feel the eyes of my other relatives on me, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They were all waiting for the explosion, for the tears, for the scene that would make this dinner memorable. I gave them nothing. I picked up my fork and took a bite of chicken. I chewed slowly, methodically, forcing myself to swallow. I stayed for another hour, a ghost at my own family's table. I listened to stories about Amanda's boutique, her upcoming trip to Aspen, her plans to renovate her beautiful house. I nodded and smiled in all the right places. The performance was exhausting, but necessary. When it was finally time to leave, I stood up and collected my plate and my mother's. I took them to the kitchen. My mother followed me, her expression a mask of strained cheerfulness. "It was so lovely to have you, dear," she said, not meeting my eye. "You too, Mom," I said, my voice empty. I said my goodbyes, a chorus of polite, meaningless farewells. My father clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of magnanimous dismissal. "Take care of yourself, kiddo," he said, already turning back to his conversation. Amanda gave me an air kiss, her cheek cold and smooth. I walked out the front door and into the cold night air. I didn't let myself breathe until I was safely inside my car, the engine running, the headlights cutting through the darkness of their quiet suburban street. And then, alone in the silence, with the fake smiles and cutting laughter still ringing in my ears, I finally let the tears fall. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of rage, a cold, hard rage that solidified into a quiet, unshakable resolve. They thought they knew my place. They had no idea who I had become when they weren't looking. A few days after the dinner, I had to stop by my parents' house to pick up some old legal textbooks I'd stored in the attic. I called ahead, and my mom said no one would be home, so I let myself in with the spare key under the pot of dead geraniums. The house was quiet. As I walked through the living room, I noticed my dad's cell phone lying on the coffee table, buzzing with an incoming call. The screen lit up with a picture of Amanda. He had accidentally activated the speakerphone before leaving the room. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it, but after the humiliation of Sunday night, I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, as my father's voice answered from the kitchen, connected through the Bluetooth speaker he was so proud of. "Hey, superstar," he said, his voice dripping with affection. Amanda's voice, tinny and strained, filled the living room. "Hi, Daddy. Is Mom around?" "No, she's out at the grocery store." "What's up? Everything okay?" There was a pause. "Everything's fine," Amanda said, a little too quickly. "Just business stuff. The boutique is doing so well that I'm thinking of expanding. I might need a small loan, just to cover the new inventory." My father chuckled, a warm, indulgent sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Of course, sweetie. Anything for my successful girl. Your mother and I were just bragging about you to the Hendersons last night, telling them all about the boutique. You're going to carry this family's name forward, you know that? You make us so proud." I could hear the smile in his voice, the blind adoration. My stomach twisted. "Thanks, Daddy," Amanda said, relief washing through her tone. Then, my father's voice lowered slightly. "It's a good thing you're so responsible. Lord knows your sister will never amount to anything. Claire, we'll be lucky if she can hold down a steady job. She'll probably need us to take care of her for the rest of her life." I stood, motionless in the middle of the living room, the weight of his words pressing the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a public dismissal anymore. This was what he truly believed. This was what they said about me when I wasn't there. A burden, a failure, a charity case in the making. But here was the thing they didn't know. I knew Amanda was lying. I had known for months. My job had taught me to see the cracks in a perfect facade, and Amanda's was riddled with them. Her life wasn't a success story. It was a carefully curated illusion, and it was about to shatter. Her boutique, Amanda's Closet, was in a trendy part of downtown. The rent was extortionate. Every time I'd walked by, the store was empty, save for a bored-looking employee scrolling on her phone. Yet, Amanda's Instagram was filled with pictures of her posing with shopping bags, captioned, "Another amazing sales day. So blessed." The house she flaunted online, the one my parents bragged about her owning, was a rental. I knew because I had seen the online listing myself a year ago, right before she moved in. Her Zillow profile was public. It clearly listed her as a tenant. A 5-minute search was all it took to see the truth. Her designer lifestyle was a mountain of debt. The new luxury SUV, the trips to Cabo, the endless stream of designer handbags, it was all financed. I suspected it started with a few credit cards, then store cards, then personal loans. People drowning in debt follow a predictable pattern, like swimmers caught in a riptide. They flail, they grasp at anything to stay afloat, and they pretend to everyone on the shore that they're just enjoying the water. My parents saw none of it because they didn't want to. They were so invested in the idea of their perfect daughter, the one who validated all their hopes and dreams, that they willingly ignored every red flag. Amanda's success was their success. It gave them something to boast about at dinner parties. My perceived failure gave them something to worry about, a way to feel needed, but ultimately, it was a disappointment. They had poured all of their emotional stock into Amanda, and they couldn't afford for her to fail. Listening to my father's voice echoing through the empty house, I didn't feel sad anymore. The hurt was still there, a dull ache deep in my chest, but it was being replaced by a cold, hard clarity. They weren't just misguided. This was a willful blindness, a deliberate choice to build one daughter up by tearing the other one down. They weren't just participants in Amanda's lie, they were co-authors. And as I stood there, hearing my father promise Amanda another loan she'd never repay, I realized the full extent of the betrayal. They weren't just hurting me with their words. They were actively funding the lie that was being used as a weapon against me. Their money, their pride, their love, it was all tangled up in this fantasy. I quietly backed out of the living room, went up to the attic, and gathered my books. My hands were steady. My mind was sharp. For years I had craved their approval, hoping that one day they would finally see me. Now I understood they never would. They didn't see me or Amanda. They only saw the stories they wanted to tell themselves. And I was no longer interested in being the villain in their fairy tale. My office is on the 12th floor of a glass and steel building downtown, overlooking the Scioto River. It's a world away from my parents' cozy, suffocating suburban home. Here, there are no family photos on the walls, no ghosts of childhood disappointments lingering in the corners. The space is minimalist, modern, and orderly. Everything has its place. Here, I am not Claire the Quiet One, or Amanda's sister. I am Claire Donovan, Esquire. I am in control. My family knew I was a lawyer, but their understanding of my career was vague and dismissive. They imagined I was a paper pusher in a stuffy, low-profile firm, handling minor disputes or writing simple wills. Claire does legal stuff, my mom would say, as if describing a hobby like knitting. They never asked about my specialty. They never asked about my firm. The truth was, I had built my consultancy from the ground up. I started with a handful of clients and a rented desk in a shared workspace. Now, I had a team of 5 and a reputation for being one of the most meticulous and effective bankruptcy attorneys in the state. I didn't handle glamorous corporate mergers or high-profile criminal cases. I dealt with financial ruin. My clients were people whose lives had unraveled, small business owners who had risked everything and lost, families who had been buried by medical bills, individuals who had made a series of bad choices that had snowballed into catastrophe. My job was to guide them through the painful, humiliating process of declaring bankruptcy. It required empathy, but it also required a ruthless attention to detail. I had to sift through the wreckage of people's lives, uncovering every hidden asset, every desperate loan, every financial secret. I was good at it because I understood desperation, and I was an expert at finding the truth buried beneath layers of shame and pretense. For years, I kept this part of my life separate. It was easier than trying to explain it to them, easier than watching their eyes glaze over with boredom or worse, pity. I let them believe I was mediocre because the effort of proving them wrong was simply too exhausting. What was the point of telling them about a major victory in court if they were just going to change the subject to Amanda's latest Instagram post? So I let them have their narrative. I let them think I was struggling. But after that dinner, and after overhearing that phone call, something shifted. The wall I had built between my personal and professional life began to crumble. The quiet resolve I'd found in my car that night wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. It was about truth. My family had constructed their world around a lie, and I was living in the silent, uncomfortable truth. The decision wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow crystallization of thought over several days. I sat in my office, staring out at the city lights, and I saw the 2 versions of my life laid out before me. The competent, respected woman who commanded a courtroom and the dismissed, invisible daughter who couldn't even command respect at her own family's dinner table. The injustice of it burned in a way it never had before. Then, a month ago, it happened. It was a Tuesday morning. My paralegal, Maria, walked into my office and placed a new client file on my desk. It was a Chapter 11 filing, a business bankruptcy. The petitions had been filed by several major creditors, who hadn't been paid in months. "This one looks messy, Claire," Maria said, tapping the thick folder. "The owner has been racking up debt all over town, maxed out business loans, multiple lines of credit. Looks like she was using new loans to pay off old ones." I nodded, not looking up from the email I was typing. "What's the name of the business?" "Amanda's Closet, LLC," Maria said. I froze. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The quiet hum of my computer suddenly sounded like a roar. I slowly lifted my head and looked at the file. There, on the crisp manila folder, was my sister's cursive aspirational logo, the same one from the front of her perpetually empty boutique. The file was marked with a red sticker, indicating the high value of the outstanding debt. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. This was it, the inevitable collision. Maria was still talking, detailing the list of creditors, but her voice faded into the background. My world narrowed to that folder. It felt like destiny, or maybe just grim, cosmic irony. Of all the bankruptcy firms in Columbus, her case had landed with mine, and of all the attorneys in my firm, it had landed on my desk. I could have recused myself. I should have. Citing a conflict of interest would have been the professional, ethical thing to do. I could have passed the file to a colleague, washed my hands of it, and let the drama unfold from a distance. The old me, the one who avoided confrontation and craved peace at any cost, would have done just that. But I wasn't the old me anymore, thought of my father's voice. Your sister is successful and responsible, unlike you. I thought of Amanda's whisper. Maybe just accept your place. I thought of all the years I had spent making myself small to make them comfortable. My hands were perfectly steady as I reached across my desk and pulled the folder toward me. I opened it. Inside was the truth, laid out in black and white, a shocking ledger of fraud and failure. Every lie she had ever told was documented in bank statements and loan agreements. I'll handle this one myself, Maria, I said, my voice calm and even. It was a quiet decision, made in the sterile silence of my office on the 12th floor. I wasn't going to scream or cry or plead my case in their living room. I was going to do my job. I was going to present the facts, and I was going to do it in the one place where their opinions didn't matter, and the truth was the only thing that had any power. A court of law. The next month was a study in contrasts. By day, I was immersed in the cold, hard facts of Amanda's financial collapse. I spent hours poring over documents, my yellow highlighter tracing a path of deliberate deception. There were fraudulent loan applications where she had inflated the boutique's revenue numbers. There were credit card statements filled with lavish personal expenses disguised as business costs, 5-star hotels, designer clothes, spa treatments. She had been living a fantasy, and she'd made dozens of suppliers and lenders pay for it. My work was methodical, detached. I built my case with the precision of a surgeon, piece by painful piece. By night, I was still just Claire. My mother would call occasionally, her voice laced with a subtle, needling disappointment. "We haven't seen you since that Sunday dinner, Claire," she'd say. "Are you still upset about what your father said?" You know he was only joking. I would give non-committal answers, my voice flat. I didn't have the energy to argue. What could I say? "Actually, Mom, I'm busy preparing the legal case that's going to dismantle the fantasy you've built your life around." I saw pictures of Amanda on social media, living her final days of blissful ignorance. A weekend trip to a winery, a selfie in her new car, the one she would soon have to surrender, a picture of her and my parents at brunch, all of them smiling. Captioned, "So lucky to have the most supportive family in the world." Every post was a fresh stab of betrayal, but it only strengthened my resolve. They were all complicit in the lie. I went silent. I stopped answering texts. I let their calls go to voicemail. They probably assumed I was sulking, retreating into myself as I always had. They had no idea my silence was not a retreat. It was preparation. It was the calm before the storm. The official bankruptcy hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. The day before, I was in my office late, reviewing my notes one last time. Everything was in order. The evidence was irrefutable. Amanda and her lawyer would likely try to restructure the debt, to salvage something from the wreckage. My job, representing the creditors, was to ensure they got back every possible cent, which meant a complete liquidation of her assets. Her business, her car, her rented house full of expensive furniture, it would all have to go. That morning, I chose my suit carefully, a simple, dark gray outfit, professional, understated, and serious. I wore my hair pulled back in a neat bun. I looked nothing like the daughter they ignored. I looked like a lawyer. I arrived at the courthouse early and took my seat at the counsel's table at the front of the room. The space was formal and intimidating, all dark wood and high ceilings. It smelled of old paper and anxiety. I arranged my files neatly in front of me, my focus entirely on the task ahead. I did not look at the gallery behind me. I didn't need to. I could feel the moment they walked in. The heavy doors creaked open, and a shift in the room's energy told me my family had arrived. I heard my sister's nervous whisper, my father's low grumble, my mother's soft footsteps. I kept my eyes fixed on my papers, my posture rigid. I could feel their presence like a physical weight. Amanda, her lawyer, and my parents took their seats in the front row, directly behind me. I imagined the scene. Amanda, trying to look poised and confident, wearing a power suit she couldn't afford. My father, scowling, looking out of place and annoyed to be there. My mother, wringing her hands, looking pale and worried. They were there to support the successful daughter through a minor, unfortunate setback. A few moments of tense silence passed. I could feel my father's eyes burning into the back of my head. I heard him mutter to my mother, his voice a low, irritated whisper that carried easily in the quiet room. What is she doing here? I didn't turn. I didn't react. Let him wonder. Let him assume I was there to gloat, to witness my sister's downfall. His underestimation of me had always been his greatest blind spot. He still saw me as the insignificant child, the dramatic daughter who made scenes. He couldn't possibly conceive of any other reason for me to be there. The bailiff called the room to order. We all stood as the judge entered and took her seat on the bench. My heart was a steady, rhythmic beat. I was not nervous. I was ready. We are here today to hear the case of Amanda's Closet, LLC, Chapter 11 Bankruptcy, the judge said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. She looked down at the paperwork before her. Amanda shifted nervously in her seat. Behind me, my father sighed impatiently. The judge looked up, over her glasses, first at Amanda's lawyer, and then she turned her gaze to my table. She cleared her throat. Counsel, please state your name for the record. I stood up, my movements calm and measured. I turned, not to face the judge, but to face my family. For the first time that morning, I looked directly at them. I saw the flash of confusion on my mother's face. I saw the flicker of dawning horror in Amanda's eyes, and I saw the pure, undiluted annoyance on my father's face, an expression that clearly said, "What do you think you're doing?" I met my sister's gaze, holding it for a long, silent moment. Her perfect, confident smile was gone, replaced by a pale, trembling mask of disbelief. Then I turned back to the judge. "Claire Donovan," I said, my voice clear, steady, and loud enough for the entire room to hear. Lead counsel for the petitioners. The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than any sound. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. My name, spoken in my own voice, echoed in that stillness, a statement of fact that felt like a detonation. I saw my sister's lawyer, a man with tired eyes and an expensive suit, lean toward her, whispering frantically, his face a mask of confusion. He had been blindsided. This wasn't in any of the paperwork. A family connection like this should have been disclosed. Amanda could only stare at me. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The smug confidence she had worn like armor was gone, stripped away to reveal the terrified, insecure woman underneath. The sister she had mocked, the one she had dismissed as a quiet, bookish failure, was standing at a counsel's table, holding the entire future of her fabricated life in a set of neatly organized legal files. The reality was too vast, too impossible for her to comprehend all at once. You're the attorney?" she finally stammered, her voice a reedy whisper that barely carried. It wasn't a question of confirmation, it was a plea for denial. She was begging for this to be a nightmare, a cruel joke. I kept my eyes locked on hers. There was no sympathy in my gaze, no flicker of shared history. In this room, she was not my sister. She was the debtor, and I was the legal representative for the people and businesses she had defrauded. "Yes," I said, my voice cold and even, cutting through the silence. I then turned my body slightly, to include my parents in my address, making sure they heard every word. "And today, we will discuss every unpaid debt you've hidden from your family." A sharp, wounded gasp came from my mother. My father, who had been frozen in a state of angry confusion, finally seemed to process the situation. His face, which had been red with irritation, began to pale. This wasn't just me making a scene. This was something else entirely. This was an ambush in a language he didn't speak, in a place where he had no power. The judge, a woman who had seen every possible kind of human drama play out in her courtroom, looked at me with a neutral, unreadable expression. "Proceed, Ms. Donovan." I gave a curt nod and turned to face her, presenting my back to my family once more. I would not look at them again. My focus had to be absolute. "Your Honor, the petitioners have filed this motion due to overwhelming evidence that the debtor, Amanda's Closet, LLC, has been operating under fraudulent pretenses for at least 2 years. The business is insolvent, and the owner has systematically and intentionally misrepresented the company's financial health to secure loans and lines of credit she had no means of repaying." As I spoke, the legal jargon flowed from me easily. Insolvency, fraudulent misrepresentation, liquidation. These were the words of my world, the tools of my trade. To my family, sitting behind me, they must have sounded like a foreign language, alien and threatening. I was deliberately creating a barrier between us, a wall of professionalism and competence they could not breach. For my entire life, they had set the terms of our relationship. Now I was setting the terms, and they were not invited to the conversation. My mind flashed back to a memory from years ago. I was home from my first year of law school, studying for finals at the dining room table. Piles of heavy books on torts and contract law surrounded me. Amanda had walked in, glanced at the mess, and laughed her light, dismissive laugh. "What is all this for, Claire?" she'd asked, picking up a book and fanning through the pages with a bored expression. "It's so dreary. Who are you planning to sue? Your teddy bears for emotional distress?" I had mumbled something about corporate law, and she had just shaken her head, a pitying smile on her face, before gliding off to meet friends. The memory, once humiliating, was now a source of cold, sharp irony. She had thought my passion was a joke, my ambition a dreary waste of time. She had never once considered that the skills I was quietly, painstakingly acquiring would one day be used to hold her accountable. She had never seen me as a threat, and that was her greatest mistake. "We will begin with the loan application. Submitted to First Merchant Bank," I announced to the court, my voice ringing with an authority my family had never heard from me. "Exhibit A, if you please." I placed the first document on the projector. It was a loan application for $200,000. At the bottom was Amanda's signature, neat and confident. Beside it, another signature, one I knew as well as my own, my father's. He had co-signed it. He had personally guaranteed the lie. I heard another gasp from my mother, this one sharper, more panicked. Behind me, the foundation of my family's world had begun to crack, but I didn't look back. I simply began to speak, my voice steady and clear, as I explained the first of many lies. My father had always been a man who took up space. His voice was the loudest in any room, his opinions the only ones that mattered, his presence a gravitational force around which the entire family orbited. He was a man built on pride, pride in his business, pride in his home, and most of all, pride in his perfect, successful daughter Amanda. His pride was his armor, and with every document I presented, I could hear that armor cracking. "Exhibit A," I repeated, pointing to the projected image of the loan application, "is the document used to secure the primary operating loan for the debtor's boutique. On line 12B detailing annual revenue, the debtor has listed a figure of $500,000. I paused, letting the number hang in the air. Then I placed another document on the projector. "Exhibit B is the official tax filing for the same year, submitted to the IRS. As you can see, the actual revenue reported was just under $60,000. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Amanda's lawyer shot to his feet with an objection, but the judge waved him down. The numbers spoke for themselves. The lie was there, in black and white, for everyone to see. I didn't look at my father, but I could feel his stare. I could feel his world tilting on its axis. I continued, my voice a monotone drone of facts. I presented evidence of the luxury SUV. The debtor claimed this vehicle, with a monthly lease, payment of over $900, was a necessary company vehicle for transporting merchandise. Exhibit C is a compilation of the debtor's social media posts, cross-referenced with the vehicle's GPS data, showing it was used for weekend trips to wine country, shopping sprees, and spa days. Next, I moved on to the boutique's suppliers. The debtor owes tens of thousands of dollars to small local businesses, a seamstress in Worthington, a leather worker in the short north, a jewelry designer from German Village. These are not large corporations, Your Honor. These are craftsmen and women who were paid with promises while the debtor used her capital to fund a lifestyle she could not afford. With each new exhibit, each new revelation, my father sank lower in his chair. The angry, confused man who had walked into the courtroom was shrinking, hollowing out from the inside. His belief system was being systematically dismantled. The daughter he had praised as responsible was a liar and a fraud. The daughter he had dismissed as a failure was the one exposing the truth, with a competence and authority he had never imagined she possessed. The final blow came when I presented a series of personal loans Amanda had taken out, all co-signed by my parents. They had put their own finances, their retirement, their home on the line to back her lies. They had done it based on the fraudulent profit and loss statements she had shown them, the same ones she had given to the banks. My parents were misled, I stated to the judge, my voice unwavering. Like the other creditors, they were victims of the debtor's financial misrepresentations. It was the only moment I offered them any semblance of grace, framing them as victims rather than enablers. But it was a cold comfort. I risked a glance at my father then. His face was ashen, the color completely drained from it. His mouth was slightly open, and his eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a terrifying cocktail of horror, betrayal, and, for the first time in my life, a sliver of fear. He was afraid of me. The power dynamic that had defined our entire lives had not just shifted, it had inverted. He was no longer the powerful patriarch, and I was no longer the disappointing child. In this room, he was just a spectator to his own ruin. He finally broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic outburst. It was a quiet, internal collapse. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders slumping in defeat. The armor was gone. He was just an old man who had bet on the wrong daughter, who had been blinded by his own pride. Through the silence of the courtroom, I heard him whisper, a broken, strangled sound that was not meant for anyone to hear. No, this can't be happening. But it was happening, and I was the one making it happen. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just the grim, hollow feeling of a necessary task being completed. I turned my attention back to the judge, leaving my father to crumble in the ruins of the world he had built. The rest of the hearing was a formality. Amanda's lawyer tried to argue for a restructuring plan, painting a picture of a young, ambitious entrepreneur who had simply gotten in over her head. He used words like miscalculation and overly optimistic. He tried to appeal to the judge's sympathy. He was no match for the mountain of facts I had assembled. For every one of his excuses, I had a document. When he claimed a vendor payment was simply overlooked, I produced a string of emails showing Amanda repeatedly promising payment while simultaneously booking a first-class flight to Miami. When he argued the fraudulent loan application was a clerical error, I presented a text message from Amanda to a friend, bragging about how easy it was to fudge the numbers to get what she wanted. I was not emotional. I was not accusatory. I did not raise my voice or use inflammatory language. I simply laid out the truth, piece by piece, building an airtight case of intentional fraud. My silence was my weapon. My calm, professional demeanor was more damning than any angry tirade could ever be. I wasn't there to yell, "I told you so." I was there to do my job. The facts would do the yelling for me. The judge listened patiently, her expression revealing nothing. But when the arguments were finished, her ruling was swift and decisive. "The evidence presented is overwhelming," she stated, her voice leaving no room for debate. "The court finds that the debtor, Amanda's Closet, LLC, knowingly and repeatedly engaged in fraudulent activities. Therefore, the request to restructure is denied. The court orders the appointment of a trustee to oversee the complete liquidation of all business and affiliated personal assets to repay the creditors." A choked sob escaped from Amanda. It was over. Her business, her car, her carefully curated life, all of it would be dismantled and sold off to pay for her lies. My father sat like a man made of stone, his face still buried in his hands. My mother, however, finally looked at me. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression a mixture of devastation and disbelief. As the judge gathered her papers and the bailiff announced the adjournment, my mother's voice cut through the noise, a desperate, broken whisper, "Claire." We had no idea. Her words reached me across the space between the gallery and the counsel's table. We had no idea. The classic excuse of the willfully blind. For a moment, I felt a pang of the old, familiar hurt. Did she truly believe that? Did she think ignorance absolved her of years of dismissiveness, of cruelty, of complicity? My internal response was cold and immediate. "You had no idea because you never looked. You never asked. You didn't want to know." But I said nothing. I didn't turn to look at her. I didn't acknowledge her words in any way. To respond would be to engage, to be dragged back into their world of emotional chaos and shifting blame. I would not allow it. Instead, I began to pack my briefcase. I arranged my files into neat stacks, clipped them together, and slid them into their designated slots. My movements were slow, deliberate, and quiet. Around me, the courtroom was emptying. Amanda was being led away by her lawyer, her body shaking with sobs. My parents remained frozen in their seats, two statues in a crumbling museum. They wanted a Christmas without me, and that's exactly what they got. I had delivered justice not with a shout, but with a whisper of facts. And in the silent, sterile courtroom, that was more than enough. My revenge was not loud or fiery. It was the quiet, undeniable truth, served cold. Once my briefcase was packed and securely latched, I stood up. The courtroom was nearly empty now, save for my family and a few court officials. I could feel their eyes on me as I turned and began to walk toward the exit. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the vast, quiet room. Each step was a deliberate move away from the past, away from the person they thought I was. Claire. It was my father's voice. It wasn't a command, not the booming tone he usually used. It was quiet, hoarse, and laced with a desperation I had never heard before. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything, including his certainty. For a single, agonizing second, I faltered. A lifetime of conditioning, of wanting, of needing his approval, screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to face him. A part of me, the small, wounded child that still lived somewhere inside, wanted to see the look on his face, to hear what he had to say now that the truth was laid bare. But I kept walking. I did not turn around. I did not slow down. I walked. Straight ahead, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped out into the hallway. The simple act of not turning back was the hardest thing I had ever done, and the most liberating. It was the final, definitive severing of a cord that had been choking me my entire life. The world outside the courthouse felt brighter, the air fresher, the city sounds, the traffic, the distant sirens, the chatter of people on the street felt vibrant and alive. It was as if I had been living my life underwater, and I had finally broken the surface. As I drove home to my apartment, I felt a strange sense of quiet. There was no elation, no triumphant surge of victory. There was no lingering anger or bitterness. Instead, there was a profound emptiness. But it wasn't a bad feeling. It was the clean, peaceful emptiness of a space that has finally been cleared of clutter. The weight I had been carrying for 29 years, the weight of their expectations, their disappointment, their narrative, was gone. I felt light. I spent the rest of the day in a peaceful daze. I went back to my office, filed my post-hearing paperwork, and debriefed my team. I was professional, efficient. No one would have guessed that I had just systematically dismantled my own family. That evening, I sat in my apartment, in the comfortable chair by the window that overlooked the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I made myself a cup of tea, holding the warm mug in my hands. I thought about power. My father believed power was money and a loud voice. Amanda believed power was the perception of success, the envy of others. They had both been wrong. I had learned that real power wasn't something you shouted or flaunted. It was something you built, quietly, in the dark. It was competence. It was knowledge. It was the ability to be the calmest person in the room. It was the strength to know your own worth without needing anyone else to validate it. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw a woman who was finally, completely, her own. For the first time in my life, I didn't crave their approval. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need anything from them at all. I had built my own strength, my own power, my own peace, and in the silence, I had proven them all wrong. But more importantly, I had proven myself right. The war was over, not because I had won, but because I had finally chosen to walk off the battlefield. That night, I sat by my window, sipping tea, feeling lighter than ever. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of possibilities, and none of them had anything to do with my family's judgment or their broken idea of success. I was free. So tell me, have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Comment your story below, hit subscribe, and let's make sure no one ever silences voices like ours again.